Now, a new analysis shows that the 6-ton iconic altar stone at the heart of Stonehenge originated from northeastern Scotland rather than southwest Wales. Scotland was never simple, not in its language, not in its legends, and certainly not in its blood. For years, we believed the Scottish genome was mostly Celtic, maybe with a dash of Viking for a dramatic flair. But that version of history has been completely shattered by recent DNA evidence. Hidden inside bones buried beneath peat bogs and rocky cairns are fragments of a forgotten world. Dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, Bronze Age outsiders, tribal ghosts called Picts, and even distant echoes from Syria, North Africa, and the Arctic steppe. Some of these genes shouldn't be here, and yet they're not only here, they've survived, untouched in remote Scottish islands, glens, and fishing villages passed down silently for over 10,000 years. This is a story of survival and extinction, of migrations we never recorded, of people who vanished from history but not from the gene pool. So what makes Scottish DNA so strange? How did it resist the genetic tides that swept through the rest of Europe? And what can it tell us about who the Scots really are and where they truly came from? If the idea that blood remembers what history forgets gives you chills, tap subscribe for more ancient mysteries decoded by DNA. And if you're as fascinated by this genetic legacy as we are, hit like. It helps bring these stories to more people who still carry pieces of the past. And tell us below, what part of your ancestry surprised you the most when you looked deeper? Long before clans, kilts, or Celtic myths, Scotland was a frozen wasteland. Roughly 12,000 years ago, during the tail end of the last ice age, thick glaciers covered most of the land. It was lifeless. No trees, no people, just ice, rock, and the roar of melting glaciers carving valleys we now call glens. But as the ice retreated, the land began to breathe again. Forests crept north, rivers swelled, game animals returned, and with them came the first humans. Small bands of hunter-gatherers drifted northward from continental Europe, following herds and fish, seeking new territory. These pioneers weren't Celtic, and they weren't what we imagine when we think Scottish. Genetic reconstructions suggest they had dark skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair, a striking appearance by today's standards, but common across Western Europe during the Mesolithic era. They lived in scattered family groups, mostly along rivers and coasts. They fished, hunted red deer and boar, and crafted flint blades and bone tools. Archaeological sites like Cramond and Oronsay have revealed their camps, but it was DNA that truly brought them to life. What shocked scientists wasn't just that their DNA survived, it was where it survived. Remote Highland glens and Hebridean islands still carry traces of these ancient lineages. The genetic markers are rare today, but their persistence tells us something remarkable. In these geographically isolated regions, the earliest settlers' genes weren't wiped out by time, they were preserved like fossils in blood. This phenomenon, called genetic drift, is amplified by Scotland's rugged terrain. Steep hills, treacherous coastlines, and scattered islands created natural gene vaults, places where small communities bred mostly within themselves for centuries. So while Europe's major cities saw constant waves of invasion, conquest, and intermixing, parts of Scotland stayed relatively untouched. This is one reason why Scottish DNA, especially in the Highlands and Islands, still holds genetic fingerprints of people who lived over 10,000 years ago. But the story doesn't stop with preservation. As time marched on, new waves of settlers crashed into these ancient bloodlines. Some blended, some buried the old, and some left only faint echoes. Roughly 4,500 years ago, a seismic shift rippled through prehistoric Scotland, not through earthquakes or war, but through people carrying pottery. Archaeologists call them the beaker folk, named after their distinctive bell-shaped ceramic vessels. But it wasn't their pottery that changed Scotland, it was their genes. These newcomers likely originated from Central Europe, regions we now call the Netherlands, northern France, and Germany. They brought metal tools, new farming techniques, and burial traditions that were entirely foreign to Scotland's native hunter-gatherers. Most importantly, they carried a very different genetic profile. Within just a few centuries, the Beaker people didn't just influence the culture, they overwrote much of the gene pool. Genetic studies show they replaced up to 90% of the male lineage in Britain, including Scotland. That means the bloodlines of many Mesolithic men simply ended while Beaker DNA surged. But this wasn't a genocide, it was slow, uneven blending, intermarriage, cultural adoption, gradual shifts. And in isolated places like the Highlands and Hebrides, traces of the older genes still survived. Scotland became a land of dual inheritance, part Ice Age survivor, part continental newcomer. With the Beakers came the Bronze Age, and with it the first signs of organized tribal life. Farming expanded, permanent dwellings appeared, and long-distance trade routes formed, connecting Scotland to far-off parts of Europe. Society became more structured, but also more vulnerable to outside influence. Soon, language began to shift too. Early Celtic dialects made their way into the region, either through further migration or cultural diffusion. These weren't the Celts of modern mythology yet, but the linguistic seeds had been planted. The landscape was changing, and so was the identity of its people. And from this evolutionary cauldron, something new emerged in the north. They carved strange symbols into stone, they terrified Roman soldiers, they fought without leaving written records. They were called the Picts, and they would become one of the most misunderstood groups in European history. For centuries, they were known only by their enemies. The Romans called them the Picti, the Painted Ones, fierce, untamed, and impossible to conquer. These northern warriors didn't build empires or write history books, but they left behind enigmatic carvings, warrior graves, and a reputation that still echoes through time. They fought from the shadows, living beyond the Forth and Clyde. But for all their impact, the Picts seemed to vanish by the 9th century. Historians were left wondering, who were they really, and where did they go? Now DNA's filling in the blanks. Recent studies from ancient burial sites in places like Ballantor in the Highlands and London Links in Fife show that the Picts weren't mysterious invaders. Their genetic signatures match Iron Age populations that had already lived in Scotland for centuries. In other words, they were locals, descendants of people who had already mixed Mesolithic and Beaker blood. The Picts didn't vanish, they merged. As Gaelic culture rose in the West, the Picts gradually adopted its language, customs, and names. They were absorbed, but not erased. Modern Highland Scots still carry traces of this lineage. Their DNA isn't just Scottish, it's Pictish. And in remote areas, isolated for centuries by mountains and sea, these bloodlines stayed surprisingly intact. So the next time someone from Caithness or Ross speaks proudly of their roots, remember, they may carry genes once worn like war paint. But Scotland's DNA story doesn't end with tribes and hill warriors. While the Picts held firm in the north, new forces arrived from the south, ones who wore sandals, built roads, and carried distant bloodlines from lands the Scots had never seen. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire reached the fringes of Scotland. They called it Caledonia, a land of wild terrain and wilder tribes. They never truly conquered it. Instead, they built forts, watchtowers, and roads. Hadrian's Wall marked the northern limit of Roman Britain, with outposts like Vindolanda keeping uneasy peace at the edge of empire. But while Rome couldn't dominate Scotland militarily, it still left a genetic footprint. Roman legions weren't just Italian. Soldiers came from across the empire, Spain, Syria, North Africa, and were stationed in Britain for years. Some formed families with local women. And while their presence was brief, traces of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern ancestry still linger in parts of southern Scotland. These aren't dominant genes, and some scientists still debate the data, but certain lowland family lines show foreign mitochondrial and Y-DNA markers that could only have come from these far-flung Roman recruits. Even without conquest, Rome injected global ancestry into the Scottish genome, an echo of an empire stretching from African deserts to northern mist. And when Rome retreated, new seafarers wasted no time filling the vacuum.
In the late 8th century, Viking longships shattered the silence of Scotland's northern coasts. These weren't just raiders, they were settlers. Over 2 centuries, Norsemen left a permanent genetic stamp on the Scottish archipelago. Orkney and Shetland became Viking strongholds. Unlike other invaders, the Norse colonized, taking local wives, farming the land, and establishing Norse law and culture. Modern genetic testing shows that up to 60% of male Y-DNA lines in Orkney today are Norse, higher than in parts of Norway itself. Viking influence spread into the Hebrides and coastal mainland Scotland, shaping trade, warfare, and settlement. Later came the Normans, descendants of Vikings settled in France, who entered Scotland through marriage and royal favor. They mixed Norse, Brittonic, and Frankish bloodlines into the southern aristocracy. Names like Bruce, Stuart, and Sinclair carry genetic roots from far beyond the Highlands. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened within Scotland itself. The clan system, long thought to reflect shared blood, turned out to be far more complex. DNA testing shows many clans weren't biological families at all, but social alliances. Some clans include dozens of unrelated male lines who adopted the same name for protection or status. Others, like the Campbells, show strong genetic continuity from a single founder. In Scotland, belonging often mattered more than blood. And through it all, geography continued to shape DNA. The Highlands and Islands acted as genetic time capsules. Places like Skye and Lewis retain markers found nowhere else in Europe. Within a single genome, you can find traces of Ice Age hunters, Bronze Age farmers, Roman soldiers, and Viking settlers. Today, Scottish genes travel far beyond Scotland. From Canada to New Zealand, from Appalachia to Australia, millions carry fragments of this ancient DNA. Modern testing can trace ancestry not just to Scotland, but to specific islands and glens preserved across centuries. Scotland's DNA isn't a clean thread, it's a tapestry, stitched with stone, bone, and fire, shaped by landscape, preserved by isolation, and carried across the world by people who never stopped calling it home. If this journey through time and bloodlines gave you a new perspective on Scotland's past, subscribe to Stone and Bone. We uncover the hidden stories your DNA still remembers. And tell us, has your DNA ever revealed connection you didn't expect?